Across England, all care home residents and staff will be eligible for a test regardless of symptoms. These mobile sites manned by the army should help, but availability is still a major frustration. And now, over 65s and their families, along with anyone in a household with someone going out to work, will be able to apply online for a test if they're showing symptoms. Repeated promises have also been made to deliver enough of the equipment staff need to keep themselves safe.
More than 1 million cases and over 58,000 people killed by the virus, which surpasses the number of Americans who died over nearly 2 decades in Vietnam. 2 grim milestones highlighting the devastating impact of COVID-19 on the United States.
It's not yet been reached. So whilst Russians are starting to get restless under lockdown, certainly indicators are suggesting that there are more people on the streets across the country now.
And the experts advising her have been saying that they needed a good 2 weeks to look to see whether there was any real impact on the infection figures from the easing of those restrictions, which, as you say, have been coming into force in a staggered way over the last couple of weeks. So it will be some time, the authorities say, until they can really actually tell whether there's a correlation between the figures we're seeing now and the impact of the restrictions being lifted. What I'd say, though, is that Angela Merkel has appeared very anxious ever since they announced those initial relaxations. She's going into that meeting today with the 16 state prime ministers. They will be discussing, for example, a template by which they can start to try and get more children back into school before the summer holidays begin.
The message from President Putin very clearly yesterday evening was that Russians must remain patient. They must remain in their houses as far as possible because the situation here is still serious. The numbers are around 93,000 people with coronavirus at the current moment. Some 867 people have died.
St Cecilia's nursing home in Scarborough locked down early. But across the 3 homes in the group, they still saw 11 deaths, 4 definitely linked to coronavirus.
This is the area that we will have for anyone that's been barrier nursed.
Mid-March, Public Health England was advising that people receiving care were unlikely to be affected and things should carry on as normal, even if staff showed symptoms. The government's been accused of not doing enough to protect the most vulnerable people. Away from care homes, there are more questions about wearing masks or face coverings. Scotland's First Minister said there could be some benefit and recommended them for enclosed spaces like public transport and shops. That's a move away from the UK government's position.
The US Commerce Department is expected to report later that gross domestic product suffered a steep drop in the first quarter of the year, with the economy shrinking by up to 4%. It will be the biggest decline in economic activity since the Great Recession over a decade ago. And there's much worse to come over the coming months, since the virus didn't begin to impact the US economy until late March.
Now that our experts believe the worst days of the pandemic are behind us, Americans are looking forward to the safe and rapid reopening of our country.
On a trip to a medical center in Minnesota, Mike Pence thanked health workers and researchers for their efforts during the pandemic. But his visit was overshadowed by his decision to ignore the hospital's rules that all visitors should wear face masks. The Vice President said he wasn't concerned about spreading the virus because he tested negative several times for COVID-19.
You have to understand, when it comes to cases, we do much more testing than anybody else. So we could go to some of these other countries, as an example, China. If you test, you're going to show many more cases. So we're doing more testing than any other country in the world by far, which we just discussed over in the Oval Office. So we're going to show more cases because we're doing much, much more testing, double anybody else.
China is a victim of the coronavirus, but China is not the source of this problem. China is not the producer of this epidemic, and that is something we have to come clean about.
We are not happy with China. We are not happy with that whole situation because we believe it could have been stopped at the source, it could have been stopped quickly, and it wouldn't have spread all over the world. And we think that should have happened. So we'll let you know at the appropriate time, but we are doing serious investigations.
American politicians have repeatedly ignored the truth and have been telling barefaced lies. They have only one objective: shirk their responsibility for their own poor epidemic prevention and control measures, and divert public attention. But the facts speak louder than words, and justice naturally inhabits a man's heart. Their plot can never succeed.
The war of words between Washington and Beijing continues regarding the coronavirus. Allegations going back and forth. It's been like this for months. Conspiracy theories being peddled by both countries, and often it's sort of in the form of a question, a rhetorical question that seems to be designed to actually just throw mud at the other side. Now, we've had this latest broadside from Donald Trump and the response from the Chinese government.
You never know about a vaccine, but tremendous progress has been made. Johnson & Johnson and Oxford and lots of good things. You've been hearing the same things as I do. Tremendous progress has been made, we think, on a vaccine. You always have to say think, and then you have to test it, and that takes a period of time.
In the meantime, much of the country is still at a standstill, with stay-at-home orders in force until at least the middle of May. 26 million Americans have lost their jobs during the pandemic.